Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, the only show that dares to be both on location or on premises, and on topic or on premise. I'm Stephen Foskett, publisher of Gestalt IT and organizer of Tech Field Day. Let's meet who's on the panel today.
Hello, I'm Troy Martin. You can find me on Twitter at TroyMart, and you can also read my blogs at wifivita.com.
I'm Sean Neal, Director of Digital Experiences for Evotech. My Twitter handle is sv_Neal, and my blog is blog.svneal.com.
Hi everyone, I'm Avril Sorter. I'm an independent consultant, and you're best to connect to me on LinkedIn. And also my Twitter handle is Avril Sorter USA. Thanks.
Hello everyone, Ozar Dondermajolu from Cellular. I run the marketing organization there, and you can find me at OZERDO on Twitter.
So here's the thing. Those of us who, like me, who are cavemen and know nothing about wireless technology are a little confused right now, because we come to these things like Atmosphere this week, and we see all this stuff that we get, like Wi-Fi. There's enterprise Wi-Fi, there's Wi-Fi 6 and all this. And then we also see a lot of private cellular, private LTE, private 5G, CBRS. And we're kind of scratching our heads. We're like, well, why do we need that? What is it about private cellular that makes sense that isn't served already by something like Wi-Fi? So I'm going to start by basically inviting Ozar to come in here and say, like, what is the pitch? Why does this make any sense at all?
Great question. I asked that to myself about 3 years ago when I joined Cellular. And honestly, the simplest answer I can give is wireless communication. I think we just scratched the surface in the last 20 years in how addictive we all become in being mobile and staying connected. I think we experience it in our personal lives. We always look for the best cellular signal where we are, and then whenever we're in a building, we always look for the great Wi-Fi signal. And I think the ability to take a cellular connection and extend it to indoor locations for your critical use cases end up like a interesting idea. The more we scratch the surface, the more we brought our solution to market. What we realize is enterprises are already thinking multi-radio, multi-frequency, multi-technology for their facilities today. So our partners, actually Aruba talks about this as multi-RAN networks. So we have customers that are simply looking at this as, if you give me a solid device ecosystem, which now private cellular has, and if you give me an additional spectrum, I will find a way to use it. And many of our customers, if not all, they're considering us to be the dedicated IoT and device and robotics camera type of network, right? So your facilities, your infrastructure devices maybe can use private cellular, and Wi-Fi continues to grow and continues to deliver high capacity to a high density of users. So that's kind of the starting point for us. Right now, I think the market is 4G, right? So the actual 5G cellular that everybody keeps talking about out there with big premises of changing the world, it's actually not here yet. So we're dealing with 4G speeds at the moment. And next year, when the 5G technology actually arrives on the radios and devices, we might even have a lot more bandwidth and much lower latency to maybe push the boundaries a bit more on the use cases. But that's kind of the initial intro, at least from my end, on how we're thinking about the tech. It's baby steps right now. It's only 2 or 3 years old, but our customers are defining a lot of interesting use cases.
So we've got these Field Day delegates here in the room. We've invited you guys in to basically help stand in for the independent world of tech. Does this make sense to you? I mean, a lot of the things that Ozar's just said, it kind of sounds like Wi-Fi to me. So, what do you guys say to this? Maybe give me the pitch here.
Yeah, I'd like to expand on Ozar's point there about the different use cases. So I work in a lot of industrial spaces. So we have open pit oil sand mines where there are 10 by 10 kilometer sections of land. and it'd be extremely cost prohibitive to deploy a massive wireless network, to power the APs, to have them connected and backhaul their network connectivity using Wi-Fi. And so to blanket a large space like that, we can use the private LTE technology to cover that space. And we're using it for methods to get metrics off the automated haulage trucks, to measure their gas consumption, their braking rates, how fast they're wearing out tires, how big of the loads that they're carrying on the trucks. And with all the dirt that they're moving, and this is where private LTE and Wi-Fi become complementary, each truck's carrying upwards of 300 to 500 tons of dirt on these transports. And so you're given a day, they're moving massive amounts of dirt and soil. And so on day one, you may have great line of sight for your LTE tower to connect to these trucks. But as they build a pile of dirt, now all of a sudden the trucks are working behind that pile of dirt, creating shadows. And this is where we find we can deploy Wi-Fi networks with very select and focused coverage and backhaul those Wi-Fi access points to the LTE network to provide dynamic Wi-Fi or wireless connectivity throughout the mine.
Yes, I think one thing that probably this whole panel agrees on, right, is you hear some of the stuff in the news about like 5G versus Wi-Fi or whatever. I think all of us are probably in favor of just more spectrum for more use cases. So just want to start sort of dispelling that piece, because it should be all complementary to your point, right? It's more space that's available, and some of it might still be looking for additional use cases. But I think, this team probably all agrees, at least there, that more is better, and we can find how, the best ways to allocate it.
So I would come at it from a technology perspective, and to build on what Ozza was saying, is that on the surface, someone might look at it and say, okay, Wi-Fi and 5G is both OFDMA now, it's both MIMO techniques, but if you go back down a level and actually look at how spectrum is being used, Wi-Fi, in the unlicensed is, you jump in, use it when you can, when it's available. The cellular is very time-orientated. It's time slots, is scheduled, it's managed much tighter. And so it's a very, very different technology. And coming back to Oz's point, if you have two different technologies, you can use them for different purposes, for different values, and an enterprise can blend those two together and couple the benefits of both worlds. And so we shouldn't look at them as competitive, because they are fundamentally very different technologies. And if we bear that in mind, we can say, yes, the enterprise really can take significant advantage on this, of delivering different types of solutions to different types of problems.
Exactly. I mean, the customer's viewpoint is always in our lens, because they trust sometimes their careers, right? You jump into a technology, and many of us, including myself, jumped into Wi-Fi technology believing that it could help me with my career growth. And thankfully, after spending so many years at Aruba, it did. And we all, I think, took advantage of that. There is a bit of that initial curve. Okay, I'm going to invest a lot of time and dollars and brain cells on learning 4G, 5G. Is it actually going to solve some problems for me, right? So a lot of our customers are actually thinking that. Is this the right time for me to push the boundary? We never get the question, why does this technology even exist? It's always the right time. Maybe it's not the right time for us. Maybe it's not the right time for me as a networking engineer, but it's never a question of if at this point. And the good news is ecosystem supports it. So, when we first started at Cellular, it was iPhone 11 came out on the day that FCC said, hey, this chunk of spectrum cannot be used for trials in the US. It's CBRS spectrum, right? That's the name of the spectrum where you can deploy a private 4G network today and down the road private 5G network. On that day, iPhone 11 was one of the very few smartphones that actually supported it. There were some gateway devices. Now we see Lenovo laptops, to iPads, Samsung. If you have 10,000 devices, let's say for Wi-Fi, it'd be like 1,000 devices that was supported, but you have any form factor type and form factor you want. And that ecosystem really drives the interest from our customers. So, hey, I heard from Zebra that they're now supporting private cellular. And they start their positioning, of course, around the device and why they came up with the use cases. So I think it's just a matter of when versus if at this point from from what we're gathering.
So if I can ask one more question, technology-wise, so I can understand why Wi-Fi makes sense, and I can also understand why Wi-Fi would be challenging in, as you were saying, like a big outdoor space like that. But of course, there's another technology, Lorawan, that's supposed to be taking some of this, industrial IoT, especially over broad distances. So is it a spectrum then that where, if you'll forgive the metaphor, sorry, radio people, is it a spectrum of solutions for different niches then? So you've got sort of very, very low bandwidth, wide area, then you've got, higher bandwidth, mid area, and then high bandwidth, short. Is that what we're looking at here with LoRaWAN, private LTE, and Wi-Fi?
I think where LoRaWAN really shines is it's designed for low power, low data rate communication. So if that's your primary requirements, it's an excellent technology for that. But when we talk about low bandwidth, we're talking like 250 kilobit type streams, like fractions of bandwidth. And depending on which region you're operating in, you're also limited to your duty cycles. So how often you communicate. So you may be limited to, 8,000 messages per day, which may meet your business requirements, may not. So if you need more bandwidth or you need more regular data transmissions, then you're looking at a different technology where Wi-Fi or private cellular can fit in.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. So let's then shift the gear. Okay, so we've decided that this makes sense, that this is something that customers want, which is what we're hearing. So how do they get started? What are they doing to bring private cellular in?
That's where the challenge starts, actually, a little bit. So one of the reasons that we actually exist as a company, it used to take a lot of effort and a lot of dollars. I mean, some of the things that network engineers had to go through to actually set up their private cellular network was just so daunting that many of them actually just stopped projects, canceled projects, and never actually tried it. There are a couple of pieces of the solution. There is the spectrum access license for CBRS, and each country has their own. There are the radios. There is a technology called mobile core. Evolved packet core is the official name in 4G, and 5G just, I think, simply calls it 5G core. There's an orchestration platform that's supposed to provision the cards, SIM cards, embedded or physical, that go into the devices to connect to the network, and then authenticate users to the radios and the core. There are a couple other pieces, like the indoor networks, for example, needs to be talking to a timing master. There's actually needs to be a PTP clock running on the network. And many of the private cellular solutions up until recently, and solutions like us were available, they would run on a dedicated internet WAN bandwidth connecting to telcos or your private cellular provider's regional cloud. Okay, so it's basically bypassing any enterprise security that you already have in place. You need to rebuild that. And then there's a couple of more things. So it's a big laundry list of things that looked nothing like enterprise networking solution. You would go get the WAN bandwidth from someone, you would go get the SIM cards from someone, you will get the radio from someone else, and you will try to stitch it together. And many enterprises went, okay, well, I can't do that. So I would say the starting point for folks is to say, okay, old traditional architecture, I'm not going to try to learn a lot of that pieces. I'm going to try to see if there are devices in my network that I'm planning to invest in. Can they support this technology? And look for those turnkey solutions. Benefits of 4G and 5G underlying technologies have been talked about. There's a lot of good sessions from Wireless LAN Professionals Conference and a couple other environments. Highly recommend watching those. Just get the fundamentals ready to go. But it all starts with the use case right now for private cellular. So device application mix, can I take advantage of, that to define what could I use this technology for, instead of just spinning cycles on which vendor for this piece, which vendor for that piece, because now there's turnkey solutions are coming to market. So that's my take.
Can I add something, a different perspective to what Oz was saying from an enterprise perspective? One of the things we've seen in the cellular standards is they've gone from a very proprietary cellular Pacific environment to adopting IP technologies. We saw that through 3G and 4G, but 5G has made a tremendous leap, and they separated out the transport layers from the higher layer cellular Pacific protocols. And they've moved to virtualization, they've adopted RESTful APIs. So many of the attributes that enterprise IT folks are familiar with, the data centers, how to manage a software-defined network, network slicing, they're already doing that in their enterprise. And now you see the 5G world has adopted those technologies. So the learning curve to adopt 5G is a lot less than I think people fear, because the underlying technologies are the same what enterprises are already deploying, and they're already experienced and equipped with that. They just need to piece together this cellular terminology that sits on top of it.
But if I can play devil's advocate to that for a minute, we have 6E coming, right? We have Wi-Fi 6 that's basically untouched currently, right? So if it's a bandwidth and it's an enterprise adoption problem and those pieces are out there, why not just move into the 6 gigahertz space, use the technology I'm already using with newer access points that support 6 gigahertz, and then carve out that space I want for, a specific use case, right? So why don't I do that?
Yeah, I mean, my take would be, if you look at the underlying benefits of the tech and you say, look, I moved to 6 gigahertz, I can now run this specific device on a clean spectrum. I have the range, tens of thousands of square feet indoors and hundreds of thousands of square feet outdoors per radio for cellular is usually the coverage range. I look at that and go, hey, 6 gigahertz also covers me there, pretty good range. And I'm able to manage it the way I like it, and the critical application that I want to put this thing on, actually I can guarantee solid throughput, predictable latency. You're actually erasing the benefits of private cellular pretty good, right? So private cellular is going to get you interference-free spectrum, it's going to get you really good range, indoor and outdoor, and it's going to get you an application level latency or throughput promise on top of quality of service. If you're going to get that from another wireless technology and you already have it, it may not be the right time for you. You're 100% right. But usually one of those three benefits kind of puts the customers around the edge and say, I really like the idea of guaranteed latency for this telnet application that's running on the tablets in this warehouse. You know what? Let's move everything else to Wi-Fi and keep using it. But then this application that's critical to us, let's keep it on private cellular. So that's the equation right now. That would be my take, at least.
And I think you also have to think that Wi-Fi is the last piece, is the radio connectivity piece. When you look at the cellular solutions and it's a total system solution. It's not just the radio, it's also the networking piece. So when you think about delivering services, you're not only just bringing the radio piece and the coverage and all of those advantages that cellular brings, or the spectrum brings, really. You're also bringing the services that come with, a mobile network, and we don't see that in Wi-Fi. We don't see it cohesively provided for an enterprise environment like you will with cellular. It's certainly been formed by innovative people. People like Aruba and et cetera, deliver those solutions. But cellular has a standard that actually brings a lot of those services. It's a system solution, not just the radio.
So on that note, another thing that comes to mind, and I know that, Troy, you mentioned this as well, is that a lot of this stuff is very US-centric, or at least it sounds very US-centric. So from somebody outside the US, how do you feel about what's being discussed?
So I guess, first off, the CBRS band, obviously very US-centric kind of terminology, but that concept expands into different regions. I think there's a huge market advantage to leverage that spectrum and take advantage of the features that private cellular offers, filling in kind of the shortcomings of Wi-Fi. So one example is one of the customers that I'm in conversations with. They manage a lot of robots inside warehouses, and they need to send very timely messages to the robots telling them where to pick a particular product from or which track to go down to avoid colliding with another robot, and they can't depend on a collision avoidance protocol. The other challenge that they have is they have global operations. So when they standardize on a wireless solution, they're looking for something that they can deploy at all their warehouses globally. Right, so if you look at something like Wi-Fi, not all the channels are available in every region. In other regions, you have to worry about radar impacts on your network, which causes additional delays, which is the primary motivation for maybe not going down the path of Wi-Fi to begin with. And so for looking at those type of solutions, they want to find something that can deploy all across different regions. And so I really like the concept of CBRS and that kind of bubble of a private LTE. And I'd like to see it deployed in other regions, but it's not available everywhere in all regions, which I think is unfortunate at this time.
You might weigh in from a Cellular perspective, being very limited to the U.S. in terms of scope would obviously be a challenge. Can you?
Yeah, so at this point, we have started our journey in U.S. Actually, we are able to deploy 4G radios because of the CBRS rules in the U.S. UK, Germany, Western European countries, Asia, Pacific. There are several countries that are coming in. I think the total list is about 12 to 15 countries at the moment that have kind of opened up a good chunk of spectrum. But they require 5G radios to be deployed. So we're going to start expanding into the regions. But the global footprint is a challenge, right? Is it going to be a challenge for solutions like us? And in certain countries, we can see ourselves having to partner with a local service provider, having access to a licensed spectrum, so that the deployment methodology, the way the enterprise manages it, integrates with your network, applies quality of service rules, everything else, should stay the same. Ultimately, we're doing a software-defined model. Underlying spectrum will change. So for a global NOC, they will log into our cloud dashboard, see all their sites, everything, all their access points, SIM cards, everything else visible. It's just that in certain countries, you might be using a different spectrum. It doesn't mean that you cannot manage it centrally, but it's a challenge for a vendor like us to tackle for our customers, right? Ultimately, they should not have to worry about this spectrum here, that spectrum there. So it's kind of our job and our challenge at the point. Yeah.
So where's this going? So let's say that somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, I got you. I see where this matters. I see why this would be useful. Is this just a point solution, or is this going to be the beginning of a whole new world of wireless communication, a whole new wireless business, basically? Is private cellular going somewhere?
I would start.
I think the
hopefully it's not no.
given that I invested the last 3 years. So I think if we don't get in front of ourselves as an industry, 5G/private 5G industry, I think it really has long legs. I was a firm believer that when you go, for example, when we first started using Wi-Fi, we thought of certain use cases, and now look at us. We practically do everything on Wi-Fi. And when we think about a network connectivity, we don't even think about an Ethernet cable anymore. It's, when you say, hey, connect to the network, everybody knows what you mean. You mean Wi-Fi. I think something like that will happen. There will be some, along the way, at least I'm hopeful that there will be multiple milestones, a new application mix, a new device mix will arrive. Robotics in warehousing is a fantastic use case because we did not thought that we will support robots in warehouses when we started 3 years ago. And now we have 2-3 customers doing exactly that, and fantastic to see it in action, but we didn't thought of it, that it will be used that way. So I think when we take the steps of going there, we're going to run into many other use cases, And I think there will be milestones, for example, always connected PCs, maybe the Lenovo ThinkPad portfolio that just started supporting private cellular. Maybe they start becoming really popular. So we might see some of those milestones. And what I really meant by getting in front of each other is over-promising. I mean, there's so much 5G over-promising going on right now. Ultra low latency, 1 millisecond, 2 gigabits of speed. No, you're not getting any of that, right? So we are bringing latency numbers to a round trip between the core and the client under 20 milliseconds. Right now it's under 40 milliseconds with LTE. That small piece of education and being frank about what the technology does actually is helpful to the network engineers, and they say, okay, I'm learning the facts. When you go out there and say 2 gigabits per second at 1 millisecond latency round trip across the network, yeah, the next time they read something real, they go, okay, these 5G guys are still dreaming, right? So I think right now the industry needs to just buckle up, stick to the facts, and enterprise network engineers should really ask tough questions to the vendors. Say, can this device support? Can you run this network? Can my robotics infrastructure stay reliable? When I call you 24/7, are you going to pick up the phone and support me, right? So the stuff that we ask companies like Aruba every day, we should start asking companies like us working on private cellular. So.
One thing that I think is really interesting that maybe a use case people didn't think of either is there's Helium, which is not only a cryptocurrency, but you mentioned Lorawan. They're also, their view is to build decentralized wireless networks globally, all over the place. So for a few years now, people could buy little Raspberry Pis essentially and deploy LoRaWAN gateways all over cities, rural areas, that kind of thing, as they built out this network. And then other companies could pay for access to that network to transmit their data. So you could have utilities, different companies connecting their end devices back home their data. Well, in the US now, with CBRS, they've opened up the opportunities. Now, essentially, instead of deploying a LoRaWAN gateway, basically have a CBRS base station that you can deploy across the country. And so as that network grows, conceivably, you could have pervasive CBRS-based coverage across the U.S., providing these little hotspots essentially all over the place.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We actually took on that concept in a recent episode of the On-Premise Roundtable where we were talking about NFTs and Web3. And it was one of those things where in that point, we had the question, is this sort of a chicken and the egg moment where you are trying to build up the infrastructure in hopes that the users will find it instead of trying to build up something that is useful on day one? Frankly, I'm much more convinced by private LTE or private cellular as a solution that's useful than by the LoRaWAN speculative frenzy, because at least here we would be talking about companies that are deploying something that they want, that they have a use for, that fits their needs, instead of, well, we've got this beautiful LoRaWAN network, how about some use cases for it, But on the other hand, I mean, if we do get this network built out, we'll see where it goes, right? Am I off base there? I mean, you guys are the wireless experts. I'm a storage guy. What do I know? Am I right about this?
So I think so. There's a couple spots for that I know I've been intimately involved in where I feel like Wi-Fi has been pushed past what I'm probably comfortable with it trying to do, right? And I'll use an example. I spent a lot of time in healthcare consulting and using smartphones to deliver nurse call messages to the nurses, including things like code blues and those types of things. I need to make sure if I send a code blue out that it gets delivered to that person, that they can react to it, right? And I think that becomes a place where it's like, that's like the tipping point to say like, hey, like this message should have been scheduled. It should be guaranteed to get through, I don't want to miss it because, somebody was automatically changing channels and just somehow it got delayed or missed or whatever. So I think there are some use cases that are starting to push past the general, like what I would consider the tipping point to say like, hey, you should really consider these use cases looking at something different.
So I'd like to add a slightly different perspective and also bringing in the earlier question as well. We've just opened up the 6 gigahertz for unlicensed, which is amazing, right? And it wouldn't have happened if the success of Wi-Fi wasn't there, because, the demand for there. But there are real problems with unlicensed spectrum in terms of the quality of service and delivery. And on the other spectrum is the licensed side, and the service provider's been paying billions of dollars for that, and they've not been using it effectively. So there's a problem over there. And so we're trying to work out where is there something, and that something is at the moment around the shared spectrum concept, right? And can we do something there to marry the benefits of both of these worlds together? And the only technology solution for that point at this point in time is the 5G solution. There is another technology. Well, actually, that's not quite true. Wi-Fi tried to play in that area, as well. But there seems to be this new model based on this physical layer that we need to make work. And I think that to answer your question is Lorawan just doesn't fit into that, right? That new model that we need to try and progress, but 5G does. And so that's my perspective anyway. I think that's where we need to focus, is that new model.
So I think you touched on an interesting point, which was the whole thing about, I think enterprise using Wi-Fi pretty efficiently overall, probably. But all these telecom companies that bought up all the spectrum and, and honestly are squatting on it in some cases, right? Wi-Fi tried to work with them. There was a period where Cisco tried to bring out APs with integrated cellular modules. Aruba went down that path. It's been tried, and the hard part was always the carriers not wanting to really play ball, right?
Right.
And so now it's kind of like, okay, so we're going to enter that space with, private options that are going to offer a similar technology, but it lets you control it. It's interesting. And, and I think there is an aspect of that control piece that's important too from enterprise security and everything else. Because you could say, like, maybe, could I build, what Cellular's trying to do if I was willing to bring Verizon into my space and let them offer a service to me? Maybe. Do I trust it? Probably not.
So what do you think, guys? Let's think about this premise. Why do enterprises need private cellular when they've already got Wi-Fi? Do you have an answer for that? Let's get a summary from you. This is the On-Premise podcast. Let's see how our premise holds up. Ozer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my vote on the topic. I totally agree that it should be part of an enterprise's tech stack. I saw this technology in action. It does work. It does solve tons of problems. I believe it's a matter of when, not an if, for many enterprises we talk to. But I also want to repeat my recommendation to everybody who's listening to this podcast. Ask really tough enterprise networking centric questions to any vendor that you go after. The toughest questions you ask to Cisco, Aruba, this is no different. It's going to be part of your network. It's going to touch your apps, devices, your users, your critical use cases. So demand to see the product, make sure that you can operate it very quickly, very easily. Those are some of the challenges that we've been addressing, but it's time to treat this thing as not an island, but a part of your network, and that means a lot of different things to enterprise networking professionals. There's a long list of requirements. When you're ready, make sure to ask those tough questions and keep vendors like us on our toes. So,
all right.
When I first started to work on wireless LANs, actually before Wi-Fi existed, the scenario was always these isolated cases, like in a conference room, in a storage location. And I feel like 5G is starting there, where we're looking at it in specific markets, like the industrial environment, the hospital environments. But I think just like Wi-Fi is going to grow and become ubiquitous across an enterprise. And I think, you're going to find Wi-Fi and 5G just because it's delivering quality of service, it's delivering reliability, But there's some things it doesn't deliver. And for large amounts of data, you really would do want to stay on Wi-Fi. You know, it does have more spectrum, it does have higher data rates. You've got a nice complement there that overlay right together. And I think an enterprise would be foolish not to consider that, because wireless is so critical to our business. Why wouldn't you want to look at reliable wireless? I mean, it's like a no-brainer. You have to look at it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I would agree that it's got to be. I think right now it probably needs to be the right use case. I do feel like, you know, this term of random or of radio access networks and having a more broad look at what wireless is, whether it's, you know, traditional Wi-Fi like we've been used to, Lorawan, Bluetooth, you know, CBRS type technologies. I think, yeah, it just becomes more bandwidth to be able to solve more problems. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think there's definitely a use case for it. And it may be early for some, right? Some people may never need it, and some people might, you know, live and die by it, roughly, you know. So I do think there's a good use case for it.
I think one of the challenges we'll face is, as technical people, we like to jump into the deep end and get involved in all the technical facts and the specifications and dig into that. But I think it's important to step back and look at the business requirements and the business needs. Ask, why are you trying to solve the problem that you're solving? And take a hard look at that, which will help you define what you're looking for out of those technical solutions, right? And so they're very specific things that private LTE solves, such as guaranteed delivery, low latency, large distance coverage, but there are other things that it falls short of compared to Wi-Fi, so that high capacity. And depending on your environments, you want to look at all the costs that are involved. It costs a lot of money to engineer a tower that's 200 feet tall, right? So you can deploy a lot of APs for the cost of building that tower, running power to it. If you want redundant towers, in case something happens, they can be quite expensive solutions. So looking at the overall needs and business requirements and taking a hard look at the cost of deploying both solutions.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the smart answer. And frankly, I think that Ozer's answer is the right answer. You know, ask the hard questions. Don't get too excited about the technology for the technology's sake. Start asking about, you know, what is this going to solve for me? Is it really going to work? Is this really a solution that's going to be a strategic solution for me? Because anyone that's going to be deploying private cellular, it has to be, I think, a strategic technical decision for that company, not just another wireless network or another technology to apply here or there. I think this has to be, it has to really make sense for them. And if it does, well, it's a good thing that there's companies out there that are making these products that will be enterprise class, not just, you know, oh, well, you can kind of cobble this thing together, but a really enterprise class private cellular network. I think it'll probably make a lot of sense for some people. So thank you very much for joining us for the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do give it a subscription. We're available on most podcast services as well as YouTube/Gestalt IT video. And you can find show notes and more episodes at gestaltit.com/podcast. This podcast is brought to you by gestaltit.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.